Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. It's great to hear about all your work on multiculturalism, older learners, fathers, parenting, and the rest of it. And it's something that I hope to learn a good deal more about in the near future. What I'm going to do, what I've been asked to do, and I hope you'll find helpful, is to just tell you a little bit about a centre that was set up exclusively to look into the wider benefits of learning. I'll dip into a few areas that we researched into: early years, family learning, social cohesion. And then I'm going to say a little more about one of the areas that we looked into at great length, that's health. I've a pause here, in fact, for new arrivals.
For some learners, excuse us.
No, of course.
We wanted to hear you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I'll just start briefly again. I'm going to be talking about a centre set up at the Institute of Education, the Centre for Research on the Wider Benefits of Learning. I'm going to introduce that centre, tell you a little bit about what we've set up to do and what we achieved. I'm going to dip into 2 or 3 areas that we looked into, and then spend most of the time talking about the relationship between education and health, just to give you some idea of what large-scale research can show. I'm going to wind up with a few big gaps in the evidence. There are lots of gaps, and a few implications for policy. Centre for Research on the Wider Benefits of Learning, WBL, set up in 1999 to look into, as the name suggests, the wider benefits of learning. Wider, in this case, means not economic and not educational. Why not? Because there was already at that time, and there continues to be, an established body of evidence on the educational and economic effects and outcomes of learning. And there needs to be, those are vitally important areas on, for example, the relationship between education and productivity, or the relationship between education and earnings, or the relationship between education and employability. Even in 1999, there was a good deal known about that, but very little at that time on other outcomes, other effects, in particular personal and social and psychological. And that was our job, to look into that. It was important that the centre was interdisciplinary, by which I mean it made use of quantitative research methods and qualitative research methods, and wherever possible, these were to be integrated. And we drew on expertise right across the social sciences. Economists, of course, but also sociologists, qualitative and quantitative, psychologists, qualitative and quantitative, social scientists, social statisticians, you name it. And the areas that we were tasked with looking into will not surprise you: health, mental and physical, crime, parenting, social cohesion, and others. It was important that, although I'm going to say quite a lot about the effects and benefits of adult learning, it was important for the centre that we were able to look at the effects of learning right across a person's lifetime, right across, as the social scientists say, the life course. And it's important because, of course, there are so many relationships between what goes on when you're 5 and 15 and 25 and 35 and so on. And so we looked into the relationship between education and the wider benefits from day one. I mean day one, the moment a person is born, early years, preschool, primary school, secondary schooling, adult education, further education, and beyond. And throughout our work, there were these emphases. There were more, but there were at least these 3. One, the importance of context. An example of a context would be a school. But it was important to us not only to look at formal learning contexts, but others in which individuals learn and live. Their families, their homes, their communities, their neighbourhoods, and so forth, and to look at the relationship between those contexts in which people learn and live. It was also important to understand in great detail the processes, what social scientists speak often as the mechanisms, that explain patterns of change in learning and trajectories in learning and education across a person's lifetime. And finally, there was a great emphasis on understanding the processes and mechanisms that contribute to the exacerbation of or to the diminution of inequality. That gives you some sense of the centre, what we were tasked with, what our brief was. I'm just going to dip into 3 areas now to give you some sense of what we and our collaborators came up with. I'm going to be talking at various points about cohort studies. Forgive me if you know this already, but just a brief word about these. We are extremely fortunate in England and in the UK generally to have access to huge data sets, large-scale, longitudinal studies that make use of nationally representative samples of individuals. Typically, for instance, all the babies born in a single week in a particular year, who are then followed up, whether they like it or not often, throughout their life. We've got, for example, these big national cohorts that go back to 1946, another one in 1958, National Child Development Survey, another in 1970, the British Cohort Study, and this one, the Millennium Cohort Study. They are these huge studies administered by a number of folk, but they include the Centre for Longitudinal Studies at the Institute of Education, where I work, and the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, CLS, have done a great job in just introducing these studies to those who don't know them well, and I recommend their website to you. They are some of the richest sources of data in the world. Right, back to what I want to talk about. The Millennium Cohort Study, tracking more than 15,000 children born in 2000 and 2001. And it showed, what will be no surprise to anyone here, that many young people from disadvantaged backgrounds were educationally already more than a year behind their peers by the age of 3. And we wanted to look into more detail into this. So we wanted to look at a particular difference, I say we, WBL, a particular difference between children from advantaged and disadvantaged backgrounds. It may not be a surprise to you, but it was a surprise to me when I first realised that the ability, the evidence shows this, the ability to copy shapes and simple patterns, diamonds, crosses, things of that sort, by the age of 5, turns out to be an accurate indicator of reading and maths ability at the age of 10, and life success, that's very narrowly understood, life success, number of qualifications gained, at the age of 30. And that link holds true for all groups except, surprise, surprise, those children who get high copying scores but who come from families who are poor or disadvantaged or have a low SES status. So it seems that family, school, you decide, are not managing to build on the early cognitive development of bright children from low SES groups. I could spend all morning talking about evidence like that. But I'm going to move on now to a very different area, an area that's pretty close, clearly, to some of the work that you're engaging in here. Family learning. I wish I had all day to talk about this. The evidence shows, beyond any doubt, the evidence is strong in this area, no doubt about that. Classes aimed at both parents and children have positive effects left, right and centre on communication and on functioning. For example, parents who take part in family literacy and numeracy programs, I'm going to come on to that in a minute, they become more aware of how to teach their children. They become more aware of how their children learn. They become more aware of what's going on in their children's schools. And parents benefit by making new friends, joining new networks. They get new knowledge about, for example, their children's curriculum and their school. They gain confidence. How often do you hear parents say who take part in classes if it's thought we've rediscovered our old selves? And this matters, at least for the audit, in addition to all that, there are significant, with the best programs, significant learning gains for both parents and children. And whilst I'm talking about wider benefits, very often, of course, wider benefits go along with other benefits. You get benefits on learning and related benefits, as with these programs. Parents and their children learn effectively on the best programs, and you see impacts on their motivation and engagement. And engagement in learning matters very significantly, as you'll see. Just a word more about family literacy and numeracy programs. There is a great deal of evidence now on the effectiveness of the most successful programs, and that applies to the effectiveness for children and parents from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. And that second point on this slide is important. The benefits from the best programs have been shown to last well beyond the duration. How often do you come across a skeptic or a policymaker who says, that's all very well, you've done this, now your course is closed, what happens 1 year down the track? In the best programs, the benefits last. You will have hundreds of examples you can talk to me about, I'm sure, in Belfast. Perhaps the best known, most authoritative, well-established programme in Europe is this one. Do you know about this one? In Turkey, the Mother-Child Education Programme, a fabulous programme that I recommend you look into. Right, next area that I want to dip into, I wish again, I don't want to say it too many times, I could spend all morning talking about any one of these areas, probably any one of these points, but I wouldn't be thanked if I did that, so I better move on. Social cohesion, another theme that we've heard something about this morning. There is evidence that shows that learning and adult education in particular can make a contribution to social cohesion and to citizenship and to associated values of tolerance and mutual respect. We conducted a 15-country study which suggested that education can contribute to cohesion in the following general ways: greater trust, more civic cooperation, and lower levels of violent crime. We found in some cases that taking part in adult education is associated with a greater likelihood of voting, is associated with reducing levels of cynicism and with reducing levels of racism. And we can break it down by curriculum area or subject area. We found that vocational, some of this is a surprise I think, vocational courses can have a positive effect on increasing the environmental concern of men. We found that. We didn't quite understand why it worked in that way, but that's what the evidence suggested. For both men and women, work-related adult education is associated with a positive willingness to work. For women, work-related adult education. For men, leisure-related adult education is associated with reducing levels of authoritarianism. And I think this last point on this slide is important. I think it's fair to say that there are some individuals who one would describe as extremist in respect of either racism and authoritarianism. We found no evidence that if an individual is in that place, adult education can make any difference. But we did find evidence that adult education can make a difference to the likelihood of getting to that place in the first place. Right, I've now dipped into 3 areas: early years, family learning, family literacy and numeracy, and social cohesion. I'm going to spend a bit more time on this last area to give you a sense of what the evidence can show when we get down to a few details. I'll try and keep the technical detail to a minimum, and if there's too much of it, I apologise, but I want to give you a sense of what you can do with large-scale data if you're lucky enough to have access to that. I'm going to give an overview on the evidence first, and we'll dig down just a little bit. Education is strongly linked to health. You would all imagine that. The evidence supports that. It's also strongly linked to the determinants, the influences on health, healthy behaviours, risky contexts, preventative service use. And what is more, this is gold dust for researchers, because very often you can say the evidence suggests, there's an association between, there's some sort of relationship, and policymakers will look at you very often and say, yeah, that's all very well, but come on, give me something better than that. In this area, the evidence strongly suggests causality. What do I mean by that? I mean this, that you can show a causal relationship between what goes on in learning and education and a health profile. It's a powerful thing to be able to do. Of course education doesn't act in isolation. Of course it acts together with income, with neighbourhood, all the rest of it, but the effect of education on health is often at least as great as the effect on income, which is saying something. Those with more years of schooling tend to have better health and well-being. They tend to demonstrate, as they say, healthier behaviour. Education is an important mechanism for improving health and well-being because it reduces the need for healthcare, cost of dependency, and so forth. And finally, by way of overview, a consistent finding is that the impact of income inequality is moderated by or reduced by education. And education moderates, reduces the relationship between income inequality and health. It reduces the effects of inequality on the health of less educated people. That's the overview. I'm now going to just trot through a standard set of subject items in this area. I'm going to say a fair bit about adult learning, but I did say earlier, and I want to say also a little bit about other years, because there are so many close relationships, of course there are, between early years, formal schooling, adult learning, and the rest of it. Years of schooling. This is well established now. This is just one example of hundreds of studies. It's a Swedish study, it's a nice one. It used a school reform in 1950, which extended the required years of schooling from 7 or 8 to 9, and estimated the effects of education on an index of bad health, which combined about 50 health symptoms and self-reported health. And what was found was this: for the cohort of men born with schooling reduced the risk of poor health by 18.5% after controlling for a whole load of other possible variables. Qualifications. Heaps of evidence on this. Examples. Adults with a degree or higher, 70 to 80% more likely to report excellent health than similar individuals with school-leaving qualifications or below. Adults with qualifications at level 4, that's a post-secondary school qualification, or above, but below degree level, 40% more likely to report excellent health than those with school-leaving qualifications or below. Flourishing. We used the 1958, if you remember I talked about the cohort study. We made use of the 1958 cohort study. That's roughly starting with a sample of about 17,500 individuals born in a particular week in 58. And we controlled for a whole set of background variables up to the age of 7. Found that the failure to flourish at secondary school, flourishing here means instead not just getting a load of qualifications, but socially, psychologically, and the rest of it. The failure to flourish at secondary school was associated with poorer physical and mental health, health behaviours, and well-being at the age of 33. This slide is important because it comes back to the importance of engagement. Both attainment at school and engagement with school are markers of adult health. It's true that outcomes are poor for those who don't achieve well despite their good engagement, but they are significantly worse still for those who neither engage in schooling nor attain well. Engagement matters separately from, independently of, and in addition to attainment. And that's related to attitudes to school, which also matter significantly. Teenagers, we found, who don't do well academically, yet regularly attend school, have better health as adults than truants with the same level of qualifications. General point, engagement matters, attitudes matter, separate from levels of attainment. Example, odds of being a smoker at the age of 33, 4.7 times higher for women, with no GCSE equivalents at 16 and who had been disengaged, than for women with no GCSE equivalents but who be engaged. Well-being. We used data from a big longitudinal study, Avon longitudinal study of parents and children, to look at changes in well-being across mid-childhood and early adolescence. And attainment in school was a significant positive factor, particularly, it turns out, for girls in mid-childhood. Higher scores for girls in standard assessments at age 7 predicted better than average changes in emotional, in behavioural and social well-being in mid-childhood compared with children with lower scores. Older adults. I was talking to one or two of you earlier this morning about working with and researching on older learners, and there is a very, very useful data set that we make extensive use of here, the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, ELSA. I recommend you take a look at it. Well, we have, and we find that for older learners, participating in learning is associated with improvements in quality of life, improvement in life satisfaction, improved well-being. We used ELSA, which involves more than 11,000 people aged 50 and above, to test the impact of taking part in adult learning over the previous year. You won't like this crude classification, but needs must, and we divided adult learning into 4 types. Learning leading to qualifications, formal training, music afternoon and evening classes, and gym and exercise classes. And note the first bullet on this slide. The most striking finding was that music and arts and evening classes were significantly, conspicuously now, relative to all the rest, significantly associated with positive changes in quality of life and life satisfaction, and, though to a lesser extent, well-being. I think that's a significant finding. You may have all thought that anyway, but it takes some work, I can tell you, to get the evidence to support that, which is credible. Less surprising, prior qualifications have an impact, positive impact on quality of life amongst those aged 50 and above. Those with degrees having markedly higher levels of quality of life than those with no qualifications. Mental health. This is no surprise either, the first point. Studies of learners in community-based education going back decades with a history of mental health difficulties report that participation in learning has positive effects on mental health. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that fabulous report from Veronica McGivney some years back. Well, in England, I don't know how it is here, some doctors, some GP practices prescribe education as a treatment for their patients, and these pilots have been evaluated. And in an evaluation of these pilots, patients who engage in education as part of their treatment report a wide range of benefits associated with mental health and well-being. Depression. UK graduates found to be between 35% women, 55% men, less likely to suffer from depression than similar individuals qualified to school leaving or below. We found significant effects of higher education in the UK for men. Men with higher education were less than half as likely to suffer from depression as men with qualifications below level 3, that's an upper secondary school qualification. We estimated, there's a bit of guesswork here, but it's fairly educated guesswork too, the effect that an increase in qualifications might have on levels of depression. We controlled for a whole set of background variables, prior ability, health, the rest of it. For a woman to progress from having no qualifications at all to having an academic level 1 qualification, which is the most basic academic qualification you can get, after the age of 16, that was estimated to have an effect of reducing the probability of depression by between 6 and 10 percentage points. Obesity. Education has been found to have an impact on body mass index and on the probability of being obese. A 2004 study explored factors associated with an increase in the number of obese adults in the United States since the late 1970s. Having high school education reduced body mass index by 0.50, while attending college but not graduating reduced body mass index by 0.57 compared with having less than a high school education. The larger effect was for college graduates. This was associated with a body mass index reduction of 1.50. Graduates from higher education in the UK slightly less likely to be obese, average BMI 3% lower than for similar individuals with school leaving qualifications or lower. For men, progressing from having no qualifications to a level 1 qualification, a drop in the probability of obesity estimated at between 5 and 7 percentage points. Cancer. Better educated women are more likely to protect their health with regular cervical screening tests. We calculated that between 116 and 134 cancers can be prevented for every 100,000 women in the UK in adult learning. Some of you want to know how we calculated. That was a very long answer, and we can talk about that afterwards. We estimated that between 61 and 213 cancers can be prevented for every 100,000 women who quit smoking because of their additional education. Longevity. These findings are very well known. They're repeated up and down all the way across Europe. I'm just going to give you a few specimen studies. People with higher levels of education live longer. It is as simple as that. A study from the Netherlands found that life expectancy there for men with the lowest level of education is 5 years less than for men with a university education. For Dutch women, the difference is over 2.5 years. In the US, for people aged 35 in 1960, 1 more year of education increased life expectancy by as much as 1.7 years. In Sweden, and what you're about to see here has been done all over the place, but this particular set of findings is based on a national census, which is why it helps. A study based on a national census demonstrated that 64-year-old men with a doctorate had a lower mortality rate than those with a master's degree. And master's graduates, in turn, had greater longevity than holders of bachelor degrees, and so it goes on. And this is my final area I'm going to talk about, perhaps fittingly mortality. A 2002 study finds that education was more important than income inequality in predicting mortality rates in the US. That's quite some finding. It hasn't always been replicated, but it certainly shows the very great significance of education, even in the case of mortality. And the number of years of schooling has been found to be a significant predictor of mortality after controlling for a whole set of background variables. A 2001 study shows that the years of schooling was negatively correlated with mortality for those both under and over the age of 60 in the United States. And finally, you may think it odd to take an example from Indonesia, but this is a significant finding. An increase in the average numbers of years of education in the household reduces child mortality here by approximately 10 percentage points from a mean level of 2.5%. I've only been able to dip into, even having spent more time on health than on the other areas, just been able to give you the headlines. I wish I could go into more detail about that. There are evidence gaps which I need to tell you about, because there are lots of them, too many of them. First of all, as some of you will have picked up already, too much of the evidence rests on an assessment of the impact of education which treats education solely in terms of years of schooling or years of education. And you will know, as well as anyone, why that is inadequate. In particular, it doesn't take account of the relative impact of different stages of a lifetime. It doesn't distinguish significantly enough between education in the early years, in primary school, in secondary school, in adult learning and beyond. And there's far too little evidence. There is some, but too little, on the benefits and effects of learning beyond any formal phase and beyond higher education. In other words, adult learning. We don't know as much as we ought to, specifically about the impact of adult learning on health. We know much less than we need to about the differential impact of different curricula, whether they be general or vocational or academic. And too much of the evidence comes from too few places. You can guess where they are: Northern Europe and the United States in particular. Last slide. Implications for policy. It's always tempting to finish up with 101 implications for policy, and I've got just 3. And one is this. It isn't a controversial point. It isn't a point in any doubt. It isn't a, well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. education and learning, including adult learning, has a wide range of very significant wider effects and benefits. The evidence demonstrates that beyond any doubt. Point one. Point two, contexts matter. And we don't get inside and understand how it is that learning operates in these ways, to benefit people in these ways, unless we understand the context in which individuals learn and live. And by context, I mean not only formal learning environments, I mean not only a school or a college or even an adult learning centre. And finally, and excuse me for this, because a researcher would say this, but I need to say it, you may have noticed that most of the research I'm quoting from is of a particular type. It is longitudinal, and the distinguishing feature of a longitudinal study is you start with one sample, one group of people, and you stay with that same group of people and you follow them up, hopefully over many years. It's only if you do that, presuming you've got a sufficiently large sample, that you can get right inside the detail of what accounts for how their lives develop, how they change, where there's progress and where there is not. It's an absolutely crucial resource for all of us. And when you're lobbying, you might chuck in at the end to your policy colleagues how important this resource is. And that's it. I'm happy to take questions.
I think it's time probably to turn this around. Well, we're running behind time, as per usual, but I still think I'd like to open it to the floor if anybody has a few questions for John. And also remember, John will be around for lunch as well if you want to go into any more depth with him. I'd also flag up that we are videoing John's presentation, because if the mountain doesn't come to Muhammad, well, the other way around, if Muhammad doesn't come to the mountain will go to Muhammad, and we're determined that the valuable presentation that John's just given us actually gets to the key decision makers out there. So one way and another they will be pestered by me to watch a video of this. But please take the opportunity to ask some questions of John now that he's here, because as you'll see, he's an incredible, valuable resource to any of us interested in adult education. You all go shy now.
It could be on any aspect, and including perhaps aspects you didn't hear about and was expecting to.
Yes, so.
Sorry. Thank you very much. I find it most interesting. William Devon, WEA Sector Platform. You mentioned about the early years to 0 to 5. I think it was reading about a week or so back that the years 0 to 3 are extremely important in the formation. Has that been elongated a little bit?
No, and I ought to have said if I didn't, that it was 0 to 3, at which point the gap was showing. Where are we? And by the age of 3, it is. I'd like to discuss this as a point of policy and strategy. I don't think anybody involved in adult education should be saying that the early years are not in some way absolutely critical. I think they surely are amongst the most critical and formative, practically anything that can happen in your life. And the evidence I gave from the NCS study here was indeed what had emerged by the age of 3, that 1 year gap between the advantaged and disadvantaged. And that continues to be a very significant point for research to look into. So it hasn't elongated at all. Yes?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Kelly from AXA. Fascinating presentation, thanks very much indeed. And huge amounts of compelling evidence. How have you used the evidence to lobby to date?
Okay, big subject. I was talking about this with colleagues last night. And before I answer it, I have reached the conclusion that others did long before me, that using research and communicating the messages and getting others who you want to hear those messages to listen, e.g. policy, that's a specialism in its own right. And we have individuals in England who give all of their attention to this question. They're not concerned with any particular bit of content, they're concerned with the most effective processes for communication, for dissemination, for sharing, and the rest of it. I've got no magic secrets to share with you. We know what doesn't work, of course. It doesn't work to produce a big fat research report and leave it at that, because practically nobody reads it. It doesn't, that's obvious. A little bit less obvious is it doesn't work just to produce a short, sharp, snappy executive summary. Because some people will read the bit I'll deal with first of all. If the time isn't right, it doesn't matter what you have to say, policy takes no notice. You must all have had experience of that. It doesn't matter how credible or authoritative your evidence is, somehow or another, it won't be listened to. So even if you get all the other bits I'm going to talk about right, that doesn't guarantee success. You clearly have to do a number of things, don't you? You do need to produce something short, sharp and snappy that people can read in about a minute, as well as everything else. It does that short, sharp, snappy thing that is read in a minute, has to come on the back of something thoroughly authoritative, because in the longer term, if you get the short, sharp, snappy bit right, but the evidence doesn't stack up, it'll fall away. And then you also need to hold events, you need to meet people. We found, for example, not at the WBL Centre, but at another centre very closely tied up with policy, the National Research and Development Centre for Adult Literacy and Numeracy, so also involved in adult learning, the best way to get hold of policy was not to stage a big event with lights, but to grab them over breakfast and pick out who we wanted to speak to in particular, and to be sure that it was sufficiently confidential that when we said things they didn't want to hear, it was okay. So I think my answer comes down to there's an awful lot that needs to be done, and it needs to be done at the right time with the right people, and it's not simply a matter of putting things down on paper. It's not simply a matter of getting up on a stage and talking about the headlines. Events, right times, targeting the right people, and so forth. Before I finish, if you are interested in this, you might look at some of those who've given a great deal of thought to exactly your question, how best to communicate. On using evidence, the best text I know of is written by Sandra Nuckley, who is not concerned with adult learning only, who's not concerned with education only, she's concerned with evidence right across the public sector. Sandra Nuckley, I think it's called Using Evidence. And then there are other individuals who've got a great deal of expertise on this subject in England, and in particular I would single out Andrew Morris and Charles Deforge. Anyone know of Charles Deforge? He's done a great deal of work on parenting and education. That's my answer.
Okay, thank you.